Our favorite Disney CEO Bob Iger just released his brand new autobiography, and inside it he revealed George Lucas's true feelings they were hiding from the public towards the new direction Disney has taken his franchise in the last few years. They bought him out and told him to shut up, and until now we didn't know what George Lucas's thoughts on everything in the Disneyverse was. All the killing off of all of his original characters and having them be replaced with these new characters that were made up to take the place of the legends he created the story about. All the contradictions these films have to the universe, and even more with how the new films resemble the originals, and let me tell you, it's not looking too good. But welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be going over everything Star Wars that was released in Bob Iger's autobiography, including Disney misleading George multiple times, and us finally getting to hear what the creator himself thinks of this Disney mess. Subscribe if you're new here, go down and hit that red button. It only takes a second because I'm going to be back in a few days with another video and I want to see you back here for it. And also, welcome to all the new subscribers that have recently joined the community. It seems like my Jedi mind trick must have worked on you or something, because I don't know why else you would have subbed, but I appreciate it. Now, if only my Jedi mind trick worked on Disney, maybe we could get them to make a decent Star Wars movie. But let's get back to the real topic of today. What does George Lucas think about the Disney Star Wars movies, and why haven't we heard anything about this until now? But real quick, before we jump into it, I want to say a big thank you to our sponsor today. Someone from the team over at Raid Shadow Legends reached out and said they love the channel and would love to work with us. Now, that means a lot to me because I work very hard on this channel, and I absolutely love it, but it can be a very inconsistent way to make a living. So Raid wanting to help out and support the channel means a lot, and we're going to go ahead and show them support right back. They've got this beautiful new RPG, and I've honestly had such a good time playing it so far. Their 3D graphics are way ahead of their time, the story is great, and their champions are so cool. They've got almost 10 million players worldwide that have already downloaded the game in just 6 months. It got more than 200,000 reviews on the App Store with an almost perfect 5-star rating. And they also just published this new roadmap where they announced they'll be introducing a bunch of new features like Faction Wars, a Tag Team Arena, and even a brand new clan boss that we can fight together. So if you want to play with me, you can find me in the game as Michael J, and the first 30 people that download the game will be able to join my secret clan, Rebel Scum. So be quick before the spots run out because it's literally free. And I just wanted to say I really appreciate Raid supporting the channel, and they've got a really great game here. So I want you to go down and click the link in the description to get 50,000 silver and a free epic champion as part of the new player program. We're going to show them some support right back by playing their awesome game because that's what we do around here. Now, let's jump right back into the video. Now, the weirdest thing that stuck out to me when I first heard about this is that a lot of this information makes Disney and Bob Iger himself look pretty bad. He's already announced he'll be stepping down as the CEO in 2 years when his contract expires, so why release this information that makes him look bad while he's still CEO? He probably should have waited a few years to release this stuff unless he merely put it in the book to sell more copies, which just goes to show how much he actually cares about what matters. But I want to talk about that at the end of the video because I'm glad that he decided to open up as much as he did just so we had this much transparency on the whole issue. Now, starting out in the book, he goes on to talk about how he bought Marvel and Pixar and Lucasfilm. Basically, all this takes place when Disney was originally trying to buy Star Wars from George Lucas. He was in the initial stages of working on episodes 7, 8, and 9, and had just finished an outline for each of the last 3 films. During the negotiation process between him and Disney, George sent out 3 copies of the outlines, one to Bob Iger, one to Alan Braverman, and one to Alan Horn. They read through everything and decided they needed to buy his stories, but they intentionally made a note in the contract saying they weren't obligated to use any of the plot lines that he had written out. To be honest, it sounds like they were never planning on using his stories from the beginning. It seems like it was a mere tactic they used to help convince him to sell the company. Same thing happened with the creative authority. When Lucas and Iger were discussing it, Bob Iger was very firm in that he wanted complete creative control over everything. Of course, George really didn't like this, but in the end, eventually he agreed that he would consult with them upon their request. And Iger promised that they would be open to his ideas, but even when they did go to him for help, they weren't obligated to use his ideas. I mean, best case scenario, they buy his outlines and use them to create the last 3 movies while having him on as a consultant throughout the entire process to ensure his vision gets carried out. The fans would love it, and after it's finished, Disney could take the franchise in its new direction, and the fans would be fine with that and much more accepting after Lucas got to finish his last trilogy. Worst case scenario, they set themselves up to never have to even look at his outlines again, and they never have to use him as a consultant, and they completely go off and do their own thing. And that's exactly what they did. George knew that they weren't contractually obligated to use his stories, but he thought that them buying the stories in the first place kind of implied that they'd follow his outlines, and he was pretty disappointed when he found out that his story was being completely disregarded. And when Kathleen Kennedy first took J.J. Abrams up to sit down and have a talk with George at his ranch and discuss their ideas for the film, as they began to describe the plot, George immediately got upset once he realized that they weren't using one of his stories he submitted during negotiations. He stated that the only reason he became distant with Disney as they worked on the sequels was because he knew that they weren't going to do what he wanted. If he stayed around, he would have just gotten mad and caused trouble, so he just went off and did his own thing and left them to do what they were already planning on doing with or without him. I mean, you can't blame the guy. He wants to help, but if they're deliberately ignoring him because they want to make it their way, then why waste your time? You can only do so much at that point. Kathleen Kennedy showed him an early screening of The Force Awakens, and as soon as it ended, he made no effort to hide his disappointment with the film. He pointed out that there's nothing new. In each of the films in his original trilogy, he took pride in making it a point to introduce new worlds, new stories, new characters, even new technologies. And in this movie, there wasn't enough visual or technical leaps forward. And Iger knew he was right. They intentionally wanted to create a movie that was visually and tonally connected to the earlier films in an effort to not stray too far from what the fans already loved and expected. But in doing so, they just created a soft reboot that was a mashup of everything from episodes 4, 5, and 6, but without all the main characters. It wasn't nearly as bad as The Last Jedi, but it wasn't anything close to what George Lucas had envisioned. Bob Iger continued on in his book, saying that he wanted to be careful from the beginning not to mislead George in any way, but looking back at it now, he knows he should have done a much better job of that. He said that from the very first meeting, George felt betrayed, and the whole thing was started off on an unnecessarily rocky start. And I'm not gonna lie, this isn't too big of a shock to me to hear that George Lucas didn't like what they did to his franchise. All the characters he built up and put so much love into his whole life were torn down and misrepresented so fast that all the fans stood up for him and wanted to boycott the movie and make it so that none of it was ever true and get rid of the entire movie from canon. What other film franchise has ever had that? You have to mess up really bad for something like this to happen. Iger went on to say that George was too critical of their movie and that, get this, he didn't understand the pressure of making a Star Wars film. Just listen to yourself. Do you even hear what you just said? George Lucas, the man that made Star Wars, doesn't understand the pressure of making a Star Wars film? Are you kidding me? Disney is so disconnected from the fans in reality, it just blows my mind. They didn't make a sequel that was Star Wars, they copy and pasted a bunch of things from the original trilogy to make a movie that looked and felt like Star Wars. But ultimately, they failed to deliver everything else that makes a Star Wars movie. There was no heart to any of the characters, all their planets just looked like slight variations of Earth, the story had so many plot holes and wasn't even worth following, and all the exciting teases we got in The Force Awakens, like the mystery of Snoke and the Knights of Ren and Rey's parents being somebody, were all ripped out from under us in the next movie. And making a good Star Wars movie is not some huge unattainable achievement. There's a lot of games and books that have done a great job at making expansions to the Star Wars story that look and feel like Star Wars, along with having original stories and new planets and new characters that don't have to mirror the original movies to win the fans over. If George got to use his stories for the sequel trilogy, we would have probably seen some weird stuff in them. He said that he would have liked to explore the microbiotic realm even more and explored the Wills, who are these beings who feed off the Force and have always been a great mystery in the Star Wars verse. And part of me hopes that they didn't discard his ideas because they thought they would go over people's heads or be too far out, because honestly, having the Emperor come back in Rise of Skywalker is pretty weird on its own. It's not a super grounded concept that I would expect Disney to explore. It would be sad if they gave up Lucas's concepts because they thought they were too out there, only to come back and bring the Emperor back to life. The only other time they did this on the big screen was when they added Darth Maul last minute at the end of Solo because the rest of the movie was such an unorganized mess. They saw it worked in the Clone Wars and in Rebels and that the fans loved it, so at least they'll like that part of the movie, right? Well, we'll see how Palps does in December. I'm sad to say this, but I think Lucas eventually ended up selling Star Wars to Disney because they led him to believe that they were going to use his stories since they bought them from him in the first place. But it seems as if Disney led him on to believe that they'd use his outlines only to help convince him to sell to them, even though they had never planned on using any of his stories from the beginning. There were other ways to preserve the future of Star Wars other than to sell to Disney, and I think he only did this because he was misled to believe that they would help him tell the rest of his story his way. I don't know why Disney didn't trust George and just take Star Wars in the direction he wanted. He's the one that created it in the first place. You'd think he knows what he's doing. Plus, it would have been a much smoother corporate transition if they just continued telling the story his way, but they were the ones to produce it and profit from it. Kind of like what they did with Spider-Man in the MCU while Sony still holds the rights. Star Wars lay dormant for so many years, having George Lucas come back to deliver the last 3 movies would have been what was best for everyone. The fans would appreciate them even more just knowing that they were the last George Lucas Star Wars movies they were going to get, but there would also be a sense of completeness, and I think they'd be a little more open to the new direction Disney would take the franchise in. That would have been the perfect time for them to make the movie that was The Force Awakens. They could have taken it in their own direction with all their new characters, with more movies and spin-offs after the Skywalker story was completed, and all the fans would be much more accepting of this new direction. Right now, the franchise is an absolute mess, and the story is being pieced back together as best as it can be, only to have it ending within the same 2 hours. Iger lied and Star Wars died. What did they expect to happen? I feel like that would make a good jingle. Honestly, I'm glad that George Lucas's stance on Disney Star Wars was made clear. It's great to hear that it's not just the fans that have a problem with the new movies, but also the person that created all of this in the first place is fed up with it. I mean, I would love to be able to one day read the outlines George Lucas made up for the story, but I doubt that'll ever happen. Since Disney owns them now, George can never leak them or anything on his own. Disney would have to release them in some way, which they would never do, and that's if they haven't thrown all of them in the trash already. When George was writing the outlines for the last trilogy, he was like 70 years old. Making 3 more Star Wars movies would have been a little hard as he's getting older. I'm sure he knew that if he outsourced them, they might not be as good as if he did them all himself, but I don't think in a million years he could have known someone would butcher his franchise this badly. If they had just went with his story that he originally showed them, they could have still had JJ direct the story. In fact, I think he would have done a great job executing George's vision for the first sequel film. But instead, they decided they didn't have enough diversity and there wasn't enough representation, and they felt like they needed to send a social message, and they went ahead and completely screwed up the biggest film franchise that Hollywood has ever seen. I can't wait for Mark Hamill to come out with a tell-all book one day. I would love to know all of his thoughts throughout making these last 3 movies. Maybe once his contract is up and this last movie has hit theaters and completely passed over, we'll get to hear some more from him. They showed him up pretty good during The Last Jedi's release period when he started to speak out, but I'm sure out of everyone he'll have some of the strongest opinions he's been wanting to voice. It's all kind of a little sad, but I'm still holding on to what little hope we have. The Fallen Order game comes out in November, and Battlefront is doing the best it's ever done recently, so I'm really excited for the future of Star Wars still. I just really hope they clean up their act and make some decent Star Wars movies in the future. Tell me your thoughts. Please leave me a comment and let me know what kind of videos you'd like to see next. I'll be reading through them all and responding to you guys as much as I can, but until next time, I will see you in the comments. Peace.